So I've just climbed 52 stairs. I've reached the top of the attic of St. Thomas's. What is actually happening in here, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so nowadays, this is a museum which is open to the public every day of the week. Back in the day, the uses for the space were quite multiple. Now, All St. Thomas's Church was part of All St. Thomas's Hospital. So there has been a hospital in this area since the 13th century, and that's basically when All St. Thomas's Hospital was built here. It was on the great kind of the fantastic rebuilding that took place in our space in the late 17th, early 18th century, that this church was actually built in this place on the spot where the previous church had been, and that one had been built in the 13th century. But when they actually built this church as part of the hospital complex, one of the things that they did was basically request of the architect that they needed to have an attic. The church had to have an attic, which in that time period they will have called it a garret. It's a very old word for a livable attic. So a lot of people come and they ask, hey, what is a garret? Well, let me tell you, it's a livable attic. Somewhere that you can stand up, and not have your head hit against the rafters or anything like that. So it's actually was one of the main requests that were placed by the hospital, because they needed somewhere to put stuff. So the original function of the space was literally storage.
So it's just a stock room. That's how it started.
That's how it started. Now the attic was not meant to be connected in any way with the church downstairs. So they were supposed to occupy kind of like the same kind of space, but conceptually they're different spaces. The attic was not consecrated, so it wasn't sanctified or anything like that. As a matter of fact, the architect, when the master mason.
The master mason.
Yeah. So the master mason was the person that actually built this thing. So basically what happened then was that it was requested. I lost my train of thought. Oh my God. I can keep on going. Never mind.
So the master mason wanted this to be the store.
It had to be, yeah. The All St. Thomas's Hospital actually requested to have an attic being built on top of the church because they needed storage space. Mm-hmm. Now, when it was requested for them to actually build this, the idea was that it will not be connected at all with the church downstairs because they had two separate functions. Mm-hmm. Original access would have been through an external staircase that would have allowed the people that needed to store things in the attic to go up and down. Now, originally, the attic would have been a really dark place. There were no windows, there was no skylight, there was nothing, just all of the beautiful dark wood that had been reused from the previous church. So a lot of our beams are actually from the 13th century, which is really cool when you think about it. Yeah. And of course, that was the first function of our space, was just basic storage. Now, granted, when the apothecaries of St. Thomas's heard about like this space, they just really wanted it. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't know if this happened or not, but we actually knew that some years into the opening of the space, there is a record that says that apothecaries were using the attic of St. Thomas's Church to dry and cure herbs. What that meant was that the attic was dry, was dark, and was pretty much away from vermin that would have damaged the herbs that the apothecaries of St. Thomas's used to make medicines. Mm-hmm. And of course, this was the perfect place. So the space became less of a storage for anything, but more as a herb garret, and that's where we get the second part of our name, which technically is the first function of our space from sometime in 1703 until 1822. So more or less uninterruptedly through all that time, the space contained a lot of herbs that were drying, being cured. Then they will have been taken to the workshop of the apothecaries, which was not here, it was actually next door in a smaller kind of room. And there they would have made all of the pills and all of the medicines. And then they would have brought them up here if they had done excess. And then they will store the medicines here until they were pretty much distributed amongst the patients. So that was pretty much how the space was used for 100 years. And then, of course, we come until 1822. And 1822 is a very important date for us because that's when the women's operating theater of St. Thomas's Hospital was opened. Now, the men's operating theater had already opened in 1755. And that was pretty much being open as a direct result of a new type of educational program that had opened around surgery in the 18th century. The idea was that before the mid 18th century, you actually had guilds being the ones that were training surgeons on an apprenticeship system of a one-to-one. And then at some time in the 18th century, you're going to have very entrepreneurial surgeons saying, you know what, we need more surgeons. I mean, the world has not gotten any safer. People are getting hurt. The operations that they had to be subjected to were just life and death things. So, and the amount of people that were getting hurt just increased dramatically, as with a lot of different time periods. And of course, at that point, what we're going to see is the advent of the surgical school. First private. So once surgeon decided, hey, how about if I just codify my knowledge into a curriculum, and instead of doing it on a one-to-one basis, I do it on a 1-to-100. So I have 100 students. I reduce the system from 7 years, that was usually how long an apprenticeship will last, to 4. And then I'll make some sort of assessment at the end to make sure that everybody has learned the exact same thing, and they, remember it. And then, at the end of 4 years, you have not half-baked surgeon, but like at least 4, like at least 100 surgeons that can go out and actually do some good, right? So 1755 in St. Thomas's, the surgeons here, they loved the idea of a surgical school, and they actually gave their own money to be able to create the new spaces that were needed to accommodate a school. Obviously, there's so many people that you can put around a bed, right, inside of a ward. So if you want to have a 1-to-100, you definitely need new spaces. In the north of the hospital, they opened up an annex, and in this annex, they had a pathology museum, a dissecting room. They also had a lecture hall and an anatomy theater, so that students could learn about the human body as best they could in that time period. And then, of course, in terms of surgery, because they want to become surgeons, they would have to have another space where they could actually demonstrate how these surgical procedures will be done. And of course, the actual theater format seemed to be the best. So what they did was to create a hemicycle, like every theater that you can see out there for performances of many kinds, and then place an operating table at the center. And then the students will come and they will take their places. There was a hierarchy in the different spots. In St. Thomas's, the general public was not allowed to actually witness the operations. It was literally dedicated entirely to education. So the people that would be in these operating theaters will be mostly students of surgery. And of course, what they had to do was basically observed, and they were learning by observation, and they were required to see a number of these surgical procedures for their degree to be completed. After which they will become kind of dressers, like the residents of the time period, at which point they will be assisting one surgeon throughout the procedures, but now instead of from the hemicycle, being right there with him in the floor of the operating table, operating theater, in the floor of the operating theater. So that's pretty much the beginning of the whole idea of having an operating theater, a part of this new kind of educational system to train new surgeons. And St. Thomas's had the first one built on the top of the building on the men's wards, which used to be closer to the Shard nowadays, now destroyed, unfortunately. But that was the first location for the operating theater. And then, of course, women didn't have one until 1822.
So the one you've got here,
yes,
is this for the men or for the women?
Just for the women.
This would have been one just for the women.
This would have been one just for the women. In a lot of hospitals, there was a strict separation of the sexes. Basically, your gender was a defining factor, whether you were in the men's wards, which in St. Thomas's Hospital, they were located closer to the Shard. And if you were a woman, then you'll be closer to Borough Market. So the wards closer to Borough Market, that's where you would have all of the women. So strict separation of the sexes. The men had their operating theater, 1755. Then women had to wait until 1822 to have their own operating theater.
So the one which I see when I go in there,
yeah,
is the original 1822.
Yeah.
women's
operating
theatre.
Yes.
I never knew that. There you go. Because I always had this assumption that it was just anyone for anyone.
No.
If you needed surgery and you were prepared to have people watch you as it happened, it didn't matter. But so there you go. Even I've learned something today.
No, this one actually, the interesting thing about this one was the fact that when we actually give in our talks, a lot of people have this assumption that the fact that they were women was the reason why, they didn't have an operating theater. And in a way, it's true. Before 1822. But if you think about it, there were only 3 surgical procedures that people could actually do at that time period, 18th, even early 19th century. 3, and only 3, that's it. They could not do more surgical procedures in an operating theater. They will do other ones outside. Eye surgery was very popular, but it will not happen inside an operating theater, for example. But the 3 that they knew, and they knew how to do really well, was trepanning. So somebody hits you on the head and you can use a trephine to open up the skull to allow for the excess fluids to come out. The second one will be lithotomy, which will be the removal of bladder stones, which had to be done because of the diet of the time period. Mostly men more than women, developed really, really, really huge bladder stones. Some of them the size of chicken eggs. Yes. So it becomes kind of like an issue of life and death whether you can get them out.
Yeah.
So lithotomies was the second operation that would have taken place in an operating theater. The third one being actually amputations, or any extirpation of tumors, anything that is external to the body that can be cut out. That's literally the 3 only operations that would happen in an operating theater. Now, if we're honest, in that time period, 18th, early 19th century, for all that extension of time, men had more dangerous jobs, as in soldiers, miners, farmers, sailors. And a lot of this, when they got hurt, they really got hurt bad, as in requiring an amputation or trepanation. And let's be honest, the whole issue with the lithotomy was much more common on men than on women. So those things had to be taken care of. And these are the only operations that will take place in an operating theater. And always remember that if people were in that operating theater, it's because they were already dead. They were on borrowed time. You could not survive gone untreated. These 3 operations, basically, that they were going to do to the patients, if they were not treated at that time, they will die regardless of septicemia, gangrene, anything that you can imagine, because it's an pre-anesthetic, pre-antiseptic period. So infection will be running rampant and all of the patients will just die. This was their best choice.
This was the last chance saloon for a lot of these people.
Every time that some people think about the past, and yes, I mean, surgery was called the butchering art. But the interesting thing about it was that it was a space of hope. Like, people didn't go into the operating theater, at least I don't think that people will want to go into an operating theater thinking that they're going to die. This is their best chance of survival. And hospitals in that time period were not really for the rich, were for the working poor. So, surgeons will have a lot of leeway in applying or inventing new techniques, because, these are people that, working poor, they are already on borrowed time, because if they get hurt, they won't be able to survive this no matter what. So in some cases, they will do a bit of trial and error, new techniques. But if they succeed, then they just demonstrated that it works over hundreds students.
Like a clinical trial.
It is exactly.
Wow.
But the important thing is that throughout that time period, most of those operations were most common in men than in women. Now, the women of St. Thomas's Hospital had 3 beds in the ward with the rest of the patients, where they operated upon them when they require any kind of these 3 surgery procedures. Of course, when we're talking about the early 19th century, we're also talking about the advent of the Industrial Revolution.
More accidents.
And more women actually started getting into the workforce, which meant that because they had no health and safety issues there,
Absolutely,
They're there
yeah.
for a reason. They will actually get hurt more often and in more dire kind of like conditions. We had a case study in one of our archives that basically said that there was this woman that went to one of the factories and her entire arm was shredded to pieces because it got trapped into the machinery. So they had to bring her here and they amputated her arm, for example. These are the type of accidents that become much more common now for women, which used to not be the case. Yes, they had accidents in the past, but not to the degree and the amount of working class women that actually started to suffer from this type of accidents afterwards. And so the surgeons in St. Thomas's were like, well, you know what? We definitely need an operating theater for women.
Yeah.
We're missing a perfectly good chance of teaching. The school had was quite famous. It increased the number of students that wanted to become surgeons. And then, of course, at that point, they're like, well, we need an operating theater for the women's wards. Where are we going to put it? And mind you, it has to have light. So whatever they did, they were quite sure that it had to be on top of the building. And the only place that was really available and literally next door to the women's wards was the attic of St. Thomas's Church, which already belonged to the hospital because they were using it as a herb garret. So they decided to break a passageway between the women's wards and the attic, and they opened up the skylight. They created the hemicycle. They came here and they opened up into the herb garret and opened up windows. There is some indication that the reason for opening the windows here was that they may have used the space probably as a post-op or an additional ward for the women after the operation had taken place. So that's another possibility.
All right. Wow. I had no idea. Things like that it was just women only. The Industrial Revolution helps the medical revolution. It helps the rise of women in the workplace, all these things, and they all come together here.
Yeah.
One thing I do want to know is when there's no need for the operating theatre anymore, I imagine it gets left into wreck and ruin. How did they go about discovering this place?
Actually, the fact that we still use operating theaters nowadays pretty much means that we're still using them. The thing that basically changed the history of medicine a lot was actually the advent of antiseptics.
Mm-hmm.
So when Joseph Lister basically introduced antiseptics into hospitals, it was the first time where things really, really changed. They realized that they needed to they basically realized that wood was not a very good material.
Kind of the blood just stay there, doesn't it?
Because of all the bacteria that lives in wood. The fact that the operating theater of St. Thomas's was made out of wood, because that predates anesthesia and predates antiseptics, right?
Mm-hmm.
If this operating theater had not been here on top of the attic, and if the actual hospital did not have to move in 1862 to a new location in Lambeth, it would have been destroyed, because operating theaters are like any other kind of like space inside of a hospital. It is a type of space that needs to be updated. So this is the reason why there's only 2 operating theaters predating anesthetics and antiseptics left in the world. First one is in Boston and the second one is here. I think that the one in Boston predates us by 2 years. We're very annoyed at that.
I bet you are. I bet you are.
We're very annoyed at that. But then on the other hand, we in a way we were lucky, because the railway wanted to connect Charing Cross with London Bridge, and they wanted the lands of the hospital. So they were on a legal battle for 40 years, and in the end, the courts ruled in the favor of the railway, which pretty much meant that the hospital had to be relocated to Lambeth, where it still stands. St. Thomas's Hospital is still in front of the House of Parliament in 1862, and the attic didn't need to be destroyed because the church didn't need to be destroyed, but the attic belonged to the hospital. So they boarded every access point into the attic. So they just boarded the skylight, they boarded all of the windows, and every single location where you have an access into the space was walled in. So it pretty much meant that when the hospital left, they took everything with them, and then just closed the space. And you know that saying, out of sight, out of mind?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Within a couple of years, people forgot that this was here.
And that's exactly how it's going to work, isn't it? Because if it's not used,
if it's
been moved,
exactly,
you just forget.
Exactly. And it was rediscovered in 1956.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're looking at
about 100 years.
About 100 years.
Yeah.
Where this place was just doing nothing.
Yes, it was just hidden up here. In the attic, because they just, like I said, out of sight, out of mind, they forgot completely that this existed. And then, of course, at that point, the only reason why it was rediscovered was because this scholar named Raymond Russell, who's very famous because he researched harpsichords. So he had a musical streak about him. He's wonderful. But he also collected journals from medical students from the Victorian era. And in some of these medical journals, there were references to students attending an operation in the attic of a church for women, and some of them remarked that it was very strange that it was in the attic of a church, which I actually think that is fantastic, because we still think that it's strange that the operating theater is in the attic of a church. Yeah. But it's because, it was the only space available to them at the time. Yeah. Happy accidents.
And also a hygienic place for them to. With the herb garret and all that stuff, where they are right here.
Did you say hygienic?
Well, not hygienic. That's the wrong turn of phrase, maybe. A good place for them to do it because they're storing the drugs and stuff like that.
That was moved after this was transformed into an operating theater. So the herb garret was moved to a different location. The whole reason about the fact that this is a good space is just because they just needed the space because it was here already, and they just relocated all of above the garrets, and the herbs to a new location. But no, the important part, of course, was the fact that the comments that the students had was that it was so strange, that they had to come to the attic of a church to actually see an operation, for women in their inner space. That was the weird part. And one of them actually mentioned that it was St. Thomas's. I mean, he was really frustrated because he thought, my God, am I going to have to go to every church in London trying to find if their attic has an operating theater?
Thousands of churches
exactly.
Right here. Yeah.
So he kind of thought that it would have been destroyed because there was no reference to which church it was until somebody said, "Oh, it's St. Thomas's Church." Of course, I paraphrase a lot. I have no idea if this happened or not. Yeah. We have records, but they're quite vivid in my mind about those comments. But he basically was the one that. Finally, after reading that it was in St. Thomas's, who was like, "Hey, St. Thomas is there. I might as well see if this thing's still here." And he did. He came up the spiral staircase. There used to be a little tiny hole where he thought, "Oh, maybe this is the space." And they just broke through the wall and came through. And oh, behold, the space was still here.
It's medicine's version of Howard Carter finding Tomb.
I always say that. I always say that, except that when I say this, instead of saying, how Howard Carter went around saying, when Lord Covenant said, "Oh, what did you see, man?" He's like, "Oh, I say beautiful things because everything is glittering," right? I actually like to think of the discovery here in terms of smell.
Yeah, I smell horrible things.
Like, oh my God. I mean, the space kind of has been sealed for about 100 years. Trust me, that operating theater still had a lot of sawdust in a second double floor that absorbed most of the blood. And after 1847, our space also, we know that they use ether and chloroform because they did an analysis and they also discovered that there were remnants of ether and chloroform only around the head of the operating table. So we know for a fact that was happening as well. But the smell of ether and chloroform is very pungent. We have a cabinet there with items from anesthesia and antiseptics. We basically have to wear masks to open that because it still smells a lot, and they're from the 19th century. So imagine, after 100 years, the space. I mean, the smell, the stench of the space had to be horrible.
We should make a film of it when he breaks through.
Ooh!
Let's just throw that in. What do you see?
Yeah, exactly. More or less that's the thing. But I think that in a way that's the reason why the space survived, because obviously with the advent of antiseptics, people like shifted and moved material. So wood was no longer being used. It moved to like tiles or metal, in operating theaters. And as those concepts evolved, so did the operating theater itself. And they will be using the previous one to build upon with the new techniques, because come on, hospitals don't have that much space to deal with in the first place. So they're just going to reuse the spaces that they have, updating it all the time. This one survived because, it was lost.
It survived because it was forgotten.
It was forgotten.
Amazing. That really is actually amazing. Oh, I absolutely love it here. I do. Okay, I've got to climb 52 stairs. And there was that time when you jumped into the lift as well, which, I thought, you let me climb these 52 stairs, really? Okay.
Yeah.
But when you do come here and you see it for the first time, it just brings so many vivid thoughts to your mind. Like, what is that person going through in the middle? What are these people thinking about when they actually are watching all this?
It would have been really tough because, especially before 1847, so before the advent of anesthesia, all of the patients that went to that operating theater, all of the women that got hurt badly enough to end up in that operating table, had to go through everything without anesthesia. So first of all, many of them were blindfolded before they got into the space. You have to imagine that it is an operating theater. It means that there's a public. The public are students. And the students, have you ever heard of a student that is quiet in class?
No.
I mean, you've been a teacher, so you kind of
I was
know,
a teacher,
So the thing was that we have a written account of the students in the operating theater, basically in the middle of the operation, screaming, heads, 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 I can't see, move your head, and all being, I can imagine the excitement of the students that are there to learn by observation, but they're students and they're excited. So the energy from the students is very strong, very different, and all of them are men. And yet here comes a woman, always dressed, is the Victorian era. Propriety has been observed at all times. So whether they're going to amputate her leg or her arm, whether they're going to do trepanation, they are going to have to keep her clothes on. Some of them actually from the accident, so they may have refuse and it had a lot of blood on it. It didn't matter at that time. They just had to make sure that she was covered. The blindfold was for her not to get anxiety from being the center of attention of so many students. Also, she can really tense much more her body in anticipation of when that knife is going to make it through. She will also be pushed down. The surgeon will never be alone in the floor. You will have the dressers, the residents of the period around, assisting and supporting the work of the surgeon. And most of the time that meant immobilizing the actual patient. So, I mean, I can't imagine a woman that is going to be terrified, hurting. They maybe would have given her a leather strap or a walking stick just to bite on for the pain. I mean, she'll be lucky if she passes out, right? But it would have been so horrifying emotionally. Just to have to be there and have to listen to this, being restrained, not being able to see but hear everything, and then have the surgeon just place a tourniquet so tight that it actually hurts more than being hurt in the first place. They actually had a torque and they were really able to do the tourniquet like really, 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 really tight. And then just, the amputation, which had to be done under 2 minutes. Anything over 2 minutes, and the chances of your patient surviving lessens exponentially. But yeah, it must not have been a very nice experience.
Because even though it's quick,
yeah,
it's the anticipation. It's coming through.
Yeah,
blindfolded, all the voices.
Yeah,
you've got no idea what's going to happen.
Exactly.
And then the actual operation is done.
Yeah.
That is. Because was it Robert Liston? Robert Liston was the quickest.
Robert Liston was the quickest one. He was said to have amputated a leg in 27 seconds.
That's pretty impressive.
And there are people say like it's 25. Other people say it's 30. We all agree that anything under 30 seconds is really fast.
Well, especially if some of these were going on for 2 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the thing is that that Robert Liston's record is just about cutting through the meat and the bone. After that, of course, you need to deal with all of the veins in the arteries. So some people will cauterize them or use ligatures. You still have to put it all together and basically just bandage it. So that will take a little bit longer. But the amputation per se, like 27 seconds, that is still wow.
So he was like the showman.
He was a showman.
Look what I've done, right, guys? You clean.
He
up
had a
mess.
flair for the dramatic, definitely a flair for the dramatic, in many ways. But he wasn't one of ours, unfortunately, so we can't claim him as St. Thomas's. But it's okay. We still like to use him as an example because it is quite impressive that he managed to do that. So yeah, it's kind of scary.
It is. Well, I think our time's nearly run out, I'm afraid, Monica. But thank you very much for that. That was really
You're welcome.
informative, and I hope everyone at home is enjoying this.